Okay, so I want to begin by trying to understand the significance, the religious, the historical, the theological significance of Jerusalem in Jewish theology, in Jewish wisdom, in Jewish literature. The Talmud tells us that in the Second Temple, we read this past week in the Parsha, that there is something called the Ark of the Covenant. It's a vessel that was in the Holy of Holies, that is the holiest part of the temple, the holiest vessel, and the Kohen Gadol only entered there once a year on Yom Kippur. Says the Talmud, the book of Yoma on page 54, during the Second Temple era, there was no ark in the temple. Instead, they had a rock, a stone called the Even Shasiya. It was 3 fingers protruding from the ground, and that is where they would do the service on Yom Kippur. Says the Talmud, what is this Even Shasiya? What is this stone that is at the heart of the temple and the place where the Ark of the Covenant would be? Says the Talmud, this is called the foundation stone because this is the very first stone that God used to make the world. And it is the source and the roots, and it's compared to the umbilical cord. It's the beginning of the development and the spreading out of the land. The fleshing out of the land began in Jerusalem, where the temple stands. Now, it's interesting. Today, if you go to Temple Mount, you'll notice there's a very large shrine, Islamic shrine. It's called the Dome of the Rock. So we have this ancient stone that's being talked about 2,000 years ago in Jewish history. In the year 691, the Muslims come, there's a big stone there, and they put a shrine over it, which is still there today, known as the Dome of the Rock. Is this the same stone as the Even Shasiya of the Talmud? Is the Dome of the Rock, the Haram al-Sharif, as they call it, is that the same stone that is referenced in the Talmud? Big discussions, and it's also actually very important, very relevant, because according to Jewish law, today, Jews are not allowed to tread on the same place the temple was. So, but where is it? How do we know where the temple was? We know it's on this mountain, we know it's on this plateau, but where on the plateau? This plateau is huge. It's the size of 10 football fields. Where exactly was it? If we could pinpoint where that stone is, we could triangulate from there to find out where the rest of the temple was, and we can know how to avoid it. So one of the opinions has a very long essay, and he writes, with absolute conviction that the stone that's under the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, Temple Mount, is the same stone that's referenced in the book of Yoma in the Talmud. Now others contest that fact, but it is interesting. The Talmud describes a stone that is several inches above the ground. If you look at Google images of the Dome of the Rock, it's about 20 feet off the ground. So the answer to that is that most likely this area was very heavily excavated. The Ark of the Covenant is gone. It's solid gold. And people are convinced that the Jews buried it on the site. So treasure hunters come to Temple Mount, and they start digging it up, and thus exposing the bedrock and exposing the other rock, which was underneath the ground. Regardless, what we see from this is that there's very significant spiritual significance to this location in the heart of Jerusalem, in the heart of the temple. Now, in addition, in the book of Genesis, this location is called Sha'ar HaShamayim. It's the gate of heaven. What does that mean? So the commentaries tell us, like Rashi says, if you make a prayer in Houston, Texas, or in Nashville, or wherever, that prayer has to travel to the gates of heaven. So it has to travel across the Atlantic, to Israel, to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, and that's the portal to heaven. So that kind of shows a very deep idea. This is already in the book of Genesis. This is ancient Jewish perspective. This is the portal that connects this world and the heavenly world. Now, in addition, the Jewish historical significance and connection to this location is brought out by several visitations of our forefathers to this land. If you look at the book of Genesis, by my count, there's 5 episodes in the book of Genesis where the Temple Mount is mentioned. And it's interesting, this not only establishes the Jewish people's historical connection through our forefathers, but also, if you read these stories, you'll find out a little bit about the Jewish people's religious and theological connections to this particular piece of land. So the first time it's mentioned very briefly. Abraham, he is born in Mesopotamia. He's told by God to travel to Israel, and then in Israel he travels all over the land. One of the places he visits is Jerusalem. We don't get a lot of detail about that particular visit. However, the second visit is in chapter 14 of Genesis, where Abraham, he mounts a war in the campaign of 5 kings against 4 kings. It's a very lengthy discussion, if you remember from the book of Genesis. And finally, at the end of the war, Abraham is victorious, and he travels to Jerusalem. And he meets Malki Tzedek, the king of Tzedek, Melech Shalem, the king of Shalem. He meets this person, who's the king of Tzedek and the king of Shalem. This is chapter 14, verse 18 in Genesis. And they have bread, and he pledges to give them all its tithes. What's going on? So all the commentaries explain that this is Jerusalem. And this Malki Tzedek, this individual, he is the son of Noah. He's Shem, the son of Noah. And he became the king of Jerusalem, which is called by 2 names. Tzedek, which means righteousness, and Shalem, which means peace or completion. And the idea already that we see over here is that Jerusalem was not arbitrarily selected as some city. This is a nice, picturesque city on some mountaintop in Judea. This is a city that has, in its very name, in its spiritual roots, it's called tzedek, it's called justice. And the commentaries tell us that Jerusalem has a penchant for justice. And it goes even further. And it says that to be meritorious, to live in the land and to flourish in the land of Jerusalem, you yourself have to be righteous. You yourself have to be just. And it's interesting, like the most contested piece of land is Jerusalem. Spiritually, we would tell you, by reading Genesis, is that it's the only city that you have to earn it, not only militarily, you have to just conquer the territory, you have to earn it spiritually as well. And if you're not upstanding by the standards of Jerusalem, the city of justice will evict you. That's number 1. Number 2 is called the city of Shalem, completion. Commentaries tell us this is a city where completion, where human perfection, where the human can reach the acme and the apex of their potential achievement is most conducive. And therefore it's a city that all these religious people are striving to come to because that's a place where they could spiritually soar. Now, it is also really interesting that Noah has 3 sons, and after the flood, if you read the beginning part of Genesis, he sends 3 sons in 3 different directions. His son Yefet goes to Europe, his son Ham goes to Africa, and his 3rd son Shem goes to the Near East, to Asia. So what is Shem doing in the heart of the Canaanite nation of Ham? The verse tells us, "V'haknani az ba'aretz." The Canaanites were in the land. It's the land of the Canaanites. Canaan is the 4th son of Ham. That's from the African contingency. What is Shem, who's in Asia, doing there? And the Ramban asks an interesting question. The Ramban answers, and he says, is that Shem, he knew that there was something so special. There was a gold mine, a spiritual gold mine in this city, and he pined and he yearned to go there, and he said he abandoned his family and said, I'm going to join the Canaanites. And he was like this old uncle that showed up, and they respected him so much, and therefore they allowed him to become the king. But this already shows us in the very first chapters of Genesis, of the Torah, we see many references to Jerusalem. Now, the 3rd time that Jerusalem is mentioned is by one of the most surprising and problematic stories in the Torah, the binding of Isaac. God tells Abraham, go to the land of Moriah, which is the nickname of Jerusalem, take your son Isaac, slaughter him. I don't want to spoil the story for you. Isaac survives the episode. But regardless, it's a very important juncture in Jewish history that's revisited many times. And at the end of the story, Abraham prays, and he renames the mountain. And the name for the mountain that he renames it is Har Yera'eh, the mountain that they will appear. And Abraham is prophesying that the Jewish people will appear on this mountain. Says the Midrash, what was the city called earlier? Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem, the city of Shalem. What does Abraham call it? Har Yera'eh. Put those 2 words together, Yera'eh, Shalem, Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. That's where the name comes from. And it's interesting, if it's a city of peace, it seems so poetic and apropos that the name of the city even comes from different people coming together and creating Jerusalem. Now, Isaac has another appearance under somewhat more hospitable conditions, where he goes to pray in the field in chapter 24 of Genesis. And of course, Jacob has a very dramatic pit stop on the way to go find a wife in Haran. He stops off along the way. In Parshas Vayetze, he has a very dramatic dream with a ladder that's anchored in the ground, but goes to heaven, angels going up and down the mountain. And he too, again, renames the mountain. He calls it Beth El. This is the house of God. And thus we see 5 episodes of Jerusalem in Genesis with all of our forefathers. Now, if you read the rest of the Torah, especially in Deuteronomy, there are many references for an unnamed apocryphal place. Ha-makom, the place. The commentaries tell us that whenever it says the place in the Torah, it's a reference to Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Thus, God says, you build for me a house in the place. When you get to the place, you bring sacrifices. These Sanhedrin should sit b'makom, in the place that I select. All that is a reference to Jerusalem. Even Abraham, in Vayar et hamakom merachok, in the episode of the binding of Isaac, Abraham sees the place. Why is Jerusalem not spelled out? Why do we have to work around and say the place, the place? Why does it not tell us? This is a reference to Jerusalem. So the Rambam, Maimonides, in Guide to the Perplexed, he asks this question, and he gives us several answers. But it is interesting. I'll give you one of them. One of the answers that he gives is, suppose everyone knew the coordinates of this holy place. What's going to be? Joshua comes into the land. There's a whole nation, 12 tribes, and everyone knows that there's one place that you want it to be in your tribal territory. Everyone's going to be fighting over it. Therefore, the Torah obscures, it's called the place. We'll figure out which place it is later. And therefore, there isn't like a civil war amongst the various tribes fighting to have Jerusalem in their territory. It's interesting. I read about the founding fathers of the United States. There was a whole dilemma where to put the capital. Initially, the capital was in New York, and then it moved to Philadelphia, and finally moved to the Potomac, to what's now today Washington, D.C. And how did that end up? That wasn't going to compromise, because the southern states wanted to be closer to them. They don't want to be forgotten. And the northern states wanted it there. So they put it somewhere in the middle that everyone should be happy. And it's interesting, like kind of a similar thing. If you want to promote peace and unity amongst a nation, don't try to avoid instances where there's going to be too much unnecessary strife. If we continue the rest of the Bible, we see many, many, many references to Jerusalem by name. And I think if you just read the Bible once and you count how many hundreds of times Jerusalem is mentioned, I think unless you're hopelessly stubborn, you cannot deny the ancient Jewish connection to this important city. That said, Jerusalem was not conquered by the Jews for many, many years. Moshe dies on the doorstep of Israel. Joshua, his disciple and apprentice, takes over. He's going to lead the conquest of the land. And they're going to remain in the land for about 852 years, according to Jewish sources. They get into the land. There's 7 Canaanite nations, comprised of 31 city-states, each with their own king. And it begins multi-year war, multi-decade really, and even multi-century war, with all these pockets of Canaanite resistance. Finally, King David, roughly 400 years after they enter the land, he conquers the last stronghold of the enemy territory. The last bit of enemy combatants have been squelched, and he conquers. Initially, he buys it, he conquers the rest, and Jerusalem is under Jewish sovereignty. And then the prophet comes over to him and says, King David, that place that's all over Deuteronomy, where's that? You just conquered it. This is where there's going to be built a permanent temple for God. And David's like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. When can we start? God says to him, sorry, David, you're a warrior. You have too much blood on your hands. You are not a candidate to build the house of peace for God. However, your son Shlomo, my brother tells me Shlomo is from the root shalom, peace. He is going to be the one to build the temple for God. From that point forward, Jerusalem is the political center of the Davidic monarchy. It's the religious and spiritual center of the nation. And this begins the golden era of Jewish life. The Jewish people are unified. They have righteous leaders. They have prophets. They have stability. They have security. It's the golden age of Israel, the golden age of Judea, the golden age of our nation, and the golden age of Jerusalem. King Solomon builds a magnificent and permanent temple on Temple Mount. When he finishes it, he gives a prayer, let this place be receptive. God, whoever prays here, Jew or non-Jew, righteous or wicked, this place should be a place where prayers are accepted regardless of the conditions of the person who prays. Now, this golden era, sadly, didn't last for that long. After Solomon dies, after a 40-year reign, his son Rehoboam, following some bad advice, decides to alienate various parts of the nation, and he has confiscatory taxes against the people who live in the north, and they rebel, and they secede. And in a bloodless coup, suddenly the unified kingdom, now there's a southern kingdom of Judah and a northern kingdom of Israel. And the northern kingdom of Israel is led by one of the villains of Jewish history, Yeravam ben Nevat. He is someone of great messianic potential, but sadly he squandered it all to secure his throne. What he did was, he was worried. What's going to be? The Jewish people have a thrice annual pilgrimage to the temple. They're going to go travel south, travel into the kingdom of Judea, and they're going to go to the temple. And that's going to evoke a deep feelings of nostalgia. And everyone's going to be pining for reunification. So he set up guards along all the pathways, turning around pilgrimage goers. You can't go to Jerusalem. You can't participate in the temple. Oh, and I'll build you a temple over here in the north. But sadly, it's going to be a temple for idols. And things really spiraled out of control. And despite the Herculean efforts of the great prophets Elisha and Elijah, the northern kingdom of Israel descended and devolved spiritually beyond repair. And as we know, as is evident in the Torah, when the Jewish people are not worthy of the land emits them, the land kicks them out. And it was about 150 years later, the northern kingdom of Israel is helplessly enmeshed in a life of idolatry and sin. And the Assyrians, under the leadership of Sancherib, they sweep in from Iraq in an effort to expand their empire, and they take the northern kingdom of Israel with absolute brutality and cruelty. They would flay their enemies alive. And they had a policy. Their policy was, when we capture a land, we take those indigenous people and we resettle them elsewhere. And the logic behind that is, if you want to minimize and mitigate and attenuate the risk of uprising, of revolt, what you do is you take the people and you move them out of their comfort zone. You take them and move them elsewhere, and they're very out of place, and they're not likely to band together and fight the oppressor. So all the Jews of the northern kingdom of Israel, they're all taken away. More than 1 million Jews disappear from the face of history. They are known to us as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. In their place, we get the Samaritans, and these are not the good Samaritans. These are the bad Samaritans. They're going to cause all kinds of trouble for the Jewish nation going forward. Sancherib and the Assyrians, they're not content with just taking the northern kingdom of Israel. They head south, and they're going to take on the southern kingdom of Judah under the leadership of King Chizkiyahu. Chizkiyahu finds out that the Jewish people are about to be assailed by the army of the Assyrians. He builds a massive fortification around the city of Jerusalem, 20-foot wide walls, and he prepares for the siege. It's interesting. Today you go to Jerusalem, you can go to Chizkiyahu's tunnels. The problem is that the natural water source for Jerusalem is outside the walls. So he builds a tunnel 1,700 feet long, going through solid rock, starting on either side and meeting in the middle, where the Jewish people can tunnel their way to the water source. You can actually go there today and still see the same water source in the outskirts of Jerusalem.
Is that the tunnel you walked through when you were the kingdom of David?
Yes. Yes. Now, I guess you've been there. Sancherib comes, he surrounds the city with 185,000 men. According to Jewish sources, there was a godly plague that came and swept through the troops and destroyed their firepower. They turned around and went back to Assyria. It's interesting. Today, if you go to the British Museum in London, you could find what's known as the Sancherib's Annals. These are massive clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform, where Sancherib describes his military exploits. And he details the 46 towns that he destroyed in Israel. And then he says, I got the king of Judah, Chizkiah, trapped like a caged bird. But if you read it, you'll find there's nary a reference, there's no reference of any conquest. Because he had the Jewish people trapped, but then they got out and they survived. Judah is going to survive for another 180 years until the arrival of the Babylonians. Under Nebuchadnezzar, they're going to control the Middle East, and they're going to lay siege to the city. People are going to starve. Eventually, they burst through the city, destroy the temple the 9th day of Av, and the Jewish people are sent into exile. We have very iconic teachings in Scripture about this. On the rivers of Babylon, the people are crying, what's going to be with us? We've been in Israel uninterrupted since the times of Joshua, 852 years, and now we're being led in chains to Babylon. But as we know is the case throughout Jewish history, when the Jewish people are stamped down, we have a penchant to refuse to vanish from history and to rebuild. The Jewish people become very comfortable in Babylon. It becomes a new hub of Jewish life, but Jews are always eyeing a return to Zion, a return to the holy city of Jerusalem. King Cyrus the Great of Persia, he is the next leader on the world stage, and he authorizes the return of all captured people back to their homeland, including the Jews back to Israel, to Judea. Moreover, he says, I'm going to pay the expenses to rebuild the temple. I'm going to give you a garrison to guard you as you travel the 1,000 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem. And it seems like things are great. And under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, eventually they manage to push ahead despite Samaritan inhibitions or obstacles, and they rebuild the Second Temple. But the problem is that Jerusalem, yes, it's the spiritual epicenter of the Jewish world, but the vast majority of Jews opt to remain in Babylon. The temple's rebuilt, but it lacks the former glory and splendor, and it's even lacking many of the vessels that were part and parcel of the first temple. There's no ark, there's no tablets of the Ten Commandments, there's no menorah, there's no Urim V'Tumim, there's no open miracles. Moreover, the temple is going to see wide-scale corruption. The office of the high priest, the Cong, is going to be sold to the highest bidder. There's going to be an influx of the Sadducees who are going to meddle and sabotage temple affairs. And to deal with all of these growing problems, the men of the Great Assembly, under the leadership of Ezra, they convened to try to address what's going to be with the Jewish nation going forward. Of course, they codified the Siddur, the prayer book, including in it 2 blessings about the rebirth of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of Jerusalem as well. The Persians control the world stage, but not for long. Alexander, in a 10-year conquest that's unmatched by all military campaigns since and prior, he sweeps through the known world, conquers everything in his wake, never loses a battle, controls the entire known world all the way up to India, including Jerusalem. It's interesting. Alexander's conquest of Jerusalem is bloodless. Jews are forever eternally grateful for that, and indeed, we adopted the name Alexander as a Jewish name. Until today, there's Jews named Alexander or Sender. And things are okay. We still have a temple. We still have, it's still pretty good. Yes, there's Greek influences that are cause all kinds of problems, but it seems okay. Or so it remains for 150 years, until the arrival of Antiochus Epiphanes. He is the Greek emperor of the Assyrian Greek Empire, and he comes to Jerusalem, he defiles the temple, he sacrifices a pig on the altar, he installs statues to the pagan god Zeus and of himself on Temple Mount, and he really is goading the nation into rebellion. And rebellion happens, and it happens fast, and it happens furious. A bold, courageous family from Modi'in, they begin what's known as the Maccabean Revolt. This revolt actually takes a long time, but after 25 years, they manage to kick the Greeks out and secure hegemony over the land. They go back to the Jerusalem, they rededicate the temple, and of course we have the Hanukkah holiday that celebrates this every winter. And the Jews finally, again, it took a while, but we have control of our destiny. We have control of Jerusalem. We have control of Israel. Things are amazing, are fantastic. And indeed, it begins with very high hopes. But sadly, the Hasmonean rule lasts for about 100 years, but it is one which is riddled with tragedy and corruption. These Hasmoneans, they actually adopt Sadduceanism, and they begin proselytizing, and the future kings become, they're illegitimate kings. Things really go bad. And in a terrible move, I guess in hindsight, two heirs to the Hasmonean rule, they decide to adjudicate their differences by inviting the Romans to decide. And they invite the Romans in under the leadership of Pompey in the year 63 before the Common Era. The Romans, once they put their foot in the door, they never leave. And eventually Julius Caesar appoints an individual by the name of Antipater as the governor of Judea. After he dies, his son, the tyrant, the madman, the maniac, the megalomaniac, Herod, he assumes the kingdom of Jerusalem. And he murders anyone who challenges him. He murders the Kohen Gadol, he murders his own family because he finds them to be a threat. He slays scores of rabbis in very horrific and horrendous ways. The Talmud tells us that there was one rabbi that he didn't like, but didn't really want to kill him, so he just gouged out his eyes for good measure. Really a terrible tyrant, but also a great builder. And he decides to take the temple that's been kind of languishing for a little bit, and he rededicates it. And he invests about 20 years and an insane amount of money to make it the most beautiful building in the world. And the Talmud describes it had these waves of blue crystal. It was so stunning that the rabbis made a rule. If you walk in from one exit, you have to leave from a different exit because it's so wowing. The first time you go see the temple, Herod's temple, you can't see the same thing twice because it's not the same the second time. So if you walk in the east entrance, you got to leave the west entrance, the north, the south. You can't go in and out the same exit because that's going to diminish the experience for you. He also secures Temple Mount because he expands the mountain. And he builds retaining walls around the whole mountain. And the western retaining wall still stands today. It's known, of course, to us as the Kotel Maravi, the western wall, which is the western retaining wall of Temple Mount. After Herod's death, there is a long litany of bad leadership and incompetence. Eventually, the Romans decide, we're going to take over direct rule. And things are okay for a little bit, but the problem is that the Jewish people are going to be facing internal schism, internal disunity, internal sectarianism, along with very horrific external threats by the Romans. And God always says, in every time in Jewish history, when the Jewish people decided they want to kill each other, God's going to allow other people to do a much better and more efficient job. And the spark that triggered this change is in the year 66. The Roman procurator is a division by the name of Florus. And he decides to leave the Jews in Caesarea unprotected, and the pagans of that land slaughtered thousands of Jews. Riots broke out in various cities. People were killed. Synagogues were destroyed. And the Jewish people started to mount what's known today as the Great Revolt, a revolt against Roman rule. The Emperor Nero, he sent his best general Vespasian and his son Titus to go besiege the city. Now Jerusalem, if you understand the topography of Jerusalem, it's actually a very good city to defend. There's steep ravines on both sides. It has a strong water system and natural water supplies. Also, Herod built massive fortifications around the city. It seems like it's the ideal city to withstand even a Roman siege. The problem is that there were storehouses of wheat and firewood and supplies in the city that could have sustained the city for 21 years. But there were a group of hotheads known as the Birionim. They wanted to fight the Romans. And they knew that the people inside were well fed, they'd be complacent. And therefore they sabotaged and burnt down the storehouses, and thus there was mass starvation in the city. And any Jew who would forage out of the city to try to find food would be crucified. So there's people dying of starvation inside the city. There's about 500 people a day being crucified outside the city. It's a horrific and terrible sight. Eventually, on that same anniversary of the destruction of the first temple, the 9th day of Av, in the year 70, according to most opinions, the Romans break through the city walls. They go and attack and slay and slaughter whomever is in their way. They set fire to Temple Mount. Josephus, who is a Jewish renegade who witnessed these events, describes Jews jumping in the fire to die, to expire with the temple. Heaps of corpses, ever a really horrific sight. And today you could go to Rome and see the Arch of Titus that commemorates this conquest. Now Jerusalem is now free of Jews. It's the first city that was declared Judenrat. There's coins that you can still get today. They minted coins to celebrate this event. On the coins, it has a picture of a crying widow. On it, it says Judea capta, Judea was captured. And Jerusalem really enters a gloomy period where it's really not going to emerge out of it for a long time. There was an effort about 70 years later to try to have another revolt. This was actually the most successful revolt in the history of revolts against the Roman Empire, of course known to us as the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba was a great, courageous, and charismatic Jewish leader, and he actually succeeded to kick the Romans out of Israel and out of Jerusalem. And the greatest rabbi of his era, Rabbi Akiva, actually believed that he was the Messiah. This is the messianic figure. Let's bring the Jews back to Israel, back to Torah, back to Jerusalem. But sadly, things headed south, and Hadrian, who was the Roman emperor at the time, he sent his general systematically attacking the cities, beginning from the north, heading south, and destroying and stamping out the rebellion. It's going to take another 1,813 years for the Jews to establish any sort of sovereignty over Jerusalem. Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina. Judea itself is renamed Philistinia. The city of Shechem, the Hebraic city of Shechem, is called Neapolis, new city. Of course, we know the Arabs have a hard time saying the P sound, and they substitute the B sound instead. So Neapolis becomes Nablus, the city today. And really, the Jews are going to be living primarily in Babylon, but the ones living in Israel are going to be all the way in the northern part. Jerusalem is bereft of Jews. The Romans don't really have an interest in the city. They have a temple to the Greek god Jupiter, but it's not really a center point of their lives, and really doesn't have a huge role on the world stage for several centuries. In the year 312, the Emperor Constantine, he converts to Christianity. And this marks a shift, because now the two major forces in the world, the ascendant Christian religion and the Roman Empire, are going to join forces, and that's going to cause all kinds of trouble for the Jewish people at large, as we well know. But it's going to cause Jerusalem to be now of interest for the Romans and the Christians. So he's going to knock down Hadrian's temple to Jupiter. He's going to turn Temple Mount into a garbage dump, essentially. And he takes a different part of Jerusalem, where he says, known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that becomes the center point of Christian focus in Jerusalem. Jews are only allowed to enter Jerusalem once a year to mourn and to be mocked by the Christians. Now, Jerusalem's going to trade hands several times over the next few centuries, but the Jews are almost not going to be present at all in the city. It's going to be a Roman city. The Romans become the Byzantines. It's going to be a Byzantine city. The Sassanian Persian Empire is going to capture it back. It's going to go back to the Byzantines, back to the Sassanians. In the year 638, the ascendant Muslim army is going to sweep through Israel, and the Caliph Omar is going to enter Jerusalem. And that's important to stress. The first Muslims, they actually prayed not to Mecca, but to Jerusalem. And their holy day was Saturday like the Jews. And even the 5 daily prayers of the Muslims is modeled after the five prayers that we have on Yom Kippur. And they're going to go back to Temple Mount, clear away all the debris, and make it an Islamic site. In the year 691, Abdul Malik of the Umayyad Empire, he's going to build a shrine on the Dome of the Rock. And it's going to be there until today. It's interesting. The Dome of the Rock initially was made out of lead, the dome part of it. You look at it today, it looks like it's gold. And the reason why is because in the 1960s, there were many leaks coming through the lead, So they decide to make it of anodized aluminum, which has a goldish hue. So it kind of got the goldish color. And then in 1992, King Hussein of Jordan sold one of his houses in London and used the proceeds to buy 200 pounds of gold, and they plated it with actual gold, even though it's 24 karat gold, but it's a very, very thin coating. It's 8/100,000ths of an inch thick. Very, very little. But it's interesting. Now the Muslims are in control of the land. They build this shrine, which is okay because it's not a mosque. The mosque is in the southern part in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the Jews are allowed to go back into Jerusalem. And the Muslims are very tolerant. And it seems like, and again, it's throughout Jewish history, the Muslims are much more tolerant for the Jewish people than the Christians are. Even the Muslims, it's within reason, right? In the year 720, for example, the Muslims again banned the Jews from entering it. But overall, broadly throughout Jewish history, living under Islamic rule has been much more pleasant for the Jewish people than under Christian rule. Now, Jerusalem is going to be ruled by a variety of Muslim empires for the next 400 years. In the year 1096, Pope Urban II is going to make a call to all Christian crusaders, let us go liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. This time the infidels are the Muslims. Along the way, they massacred and pillaged Jewish communities, performed mass forced baptisms. In the year 1099, 3 years after the initial crusade was called, Godfrey of Bouillon is going to lead the entrance to the city. They're going to slaughter every Muslim they find. They take the Jews, around 3,000 or so. They herd them into all the temples, all the synagogues, and they put them all to flames and burn them all down with the Jews in them. The Crusaders are going to mark a shift. They're going to erase all Jewish and Muslim signs of the city, and they're going to convert the mosque on Temple Mount to a church, and Jews and Muslims are banned from entering on pain of death once again. Come back the Muslims, and in the year 1187, the Sultan Saladin of Cairo, he comes with 30,000 warriors, and he conquers it back. And that kickstarts the Second Crusade. And basically there's 200 years of Christians and Muslim fighting back and forth, and of course we're always in the middle of that. Jewish Jerusalem is going to begin to see its renaissance in this time. The great Spanish leader, the Ramban, he has to flee from Barcelona in the year 1267. He has to flee because the Christians there want to kill him, so he ends up in Israel. And he goes to Jerusalem, and there's not even a million of Jews in Jerusalem. And he goes and scouts and finds 2 Jewish brothers from Shechem and several Jews from Hebron, brings them to Jerusalem, has a minyan, starts what's known as the Ramban Shul, which was around for hundreds of years, and Jewish Jerusalem has its renewal. And from that point forward until today, there's always going to be a Jewish presence in the city. In the end of the 15th century, Jews were kicked out of Spain during the Spanish expulsion. This actually provided a boon for the Jews of Israel, because many of those refugees ended up in Turkey, many of them in Italy, many of them in Poland and Russia, but a large contingency entered Israel, and many of them went to Jerusalem, and the Jewish population swelled. And in the year, fortuitously for them, in the year 1516, the Ottoman Turks, they conquer Israel, and they're going to be very, very pleasant for the Jews living there. In the year 1537, the Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent, he builds the fortifications surrounding the old city of Jerusalem, which still stand today, almost 500 years later. But the Jewish people in Israel, they're growing and they're flourishing. And in the 18th century, you have Jews from Europe coming. And there's the beginning of these pilgrimages where very pious and saintly Jews decide they want to move to Israel. And the students of the Gaon of Vilna come in 1808. And these communities, they begin the rebirth of the land of Israel. And they're known as the Old Yishuv. These are the Jews, very righteous, very religious, very pious, very poor Jews who are going to start populating the barren lands with Jewish settlers. It's interesting, these people live in grinding poverty, but there is an international network of fundraisers, raising funds, raising money to help sustain these settlers of the land. In the end of the 19th century, there are going to be several major developments that are going to cause another influx of population of Jews to Jerusalem and to Israel. Number one, there is the rise of anti-Semitism and pogroms in Russia. Many of the Jews are living in what's known as the Pale of the Settlement, a huge area of white Russia where there's all these little shtetls. And the Jews are convenient targets for various kinds of raids and pogroms and anti-Semitism. Many of them get fed up with it. And the 1880s mark a major point of immigration outside of Russia. So many Jews moved to the United States. The first masses of Jewish immigrants to the United States are in the 1880s, Russian and German emigres. But you also have a lot of people that decide they want to move to Israel. And thus, that helps to repopulate the land. But also, in addition, the Zionist movement is founded in the 1890s. And this is a movement to create a modern Jewish state, and they adopt one of the nicknames of Jerusalem, Zion, as the name of their movement. So you have the old Yeshuv, the original settlers, together with the new settlers. That really helps the Jewish people establish a foothold in the land of Israel and in the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Ottoman Empire, they controlled the land for about 400 years. But in the beginning of the 20th century, they see their decline. And World War I, that marks a period where Jerusalem is going to change hands once again. And the British General Edmund Allenby is going to march into Jerusalem almost exactly 100 years ago. It was in December 30th of 1917. And they're going to conquer Jerusalem from the Ottoman Turks, from the Muslims. And they're going to revive an ancient Roman name, and they're going to call this land the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, it's interesting, the Brits, they didn't want to have this as part of the empire. They wanted to hold it for a little bit and hand it off to someone else. Preferably not the Jews. At least that's how it evolved. But initially, in the year 1917, they committed in the Balfour Declaration their intent to establish some sort of Jewish state in the Jewish homeland in Israel. But their policy, at least nominally, was to ensure the safety of all peoples and all religions in the land. So you have a growing Jewish community. Many idealists of the Zionist movement, they decide to move to Israel, like David Ben-Gurion. He's a teenager, he decides, I want to go, and he leaves his family in Poland, and he moves to go join a kibbutz in northern Israel. That was an example of many people that decided to leave Europe and go to Israel. But there's tensions now going to be arising. You have a Muslim community in Israel, and their religious leaders called the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and then you have a growing Jewish community in Israel. And there's going to be a lot of infighting between these two. So, for example, in the year 1928, the Jewish people put a mechitza, a barrier separating men and women, by the Kotel. Now, at the time, the Kotel was only 8 or 9 feet wide. Today, it's like 200 feet from the Kotel to the first structures. It was 9 feet. And the Jewish people, they wanted to have a mechitza where the men could pray on one side and women could pray on the other side. So they put up the mechitza, and the Grand Mufti gets up and he gets a huge speech. The Jews are coming after the Muslim sites in Jerusalem. And he sparks these riots. Of course, it's nonsensical. Building a mechitza on the Western Wall Plaza is not going to imperil the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but the mobs they're not necessarily motivated by logic. So that kickstarts several months of fighting. And then in the following year, after a particularly raucous speech from the Mufti, there is riots that break out all over the land. And there's 133 Jews are slaughtered in Jerusalem and in the surrounding area, particularly in the city of Hebron, the ancient city of Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried. There is a horrific pogrom where the Arabs go and slaughter Jews everywhere on a Shabbos. Really sad and really horrific. Now, during World War II, this Grand Mufti of Jerusalem actually moved to Berlin. And he was a great admirer and publicly supported Hitler and the Nazis. There's a very famous picture of the Grand Mufti sitting on a couch having a brouhaha with Hitler. Now, Britain, they accepted the idea that they're going to establish a Jewish state in this land, but very quickly afterwards they regretted it. They felt like if we have to choose the Jews or the Arabs, we probably made the wrong choice by choosing the Jews. And they began to enact all kinds of hurdles for the Jews to overcome to prevent them from having the land. So, for example, there's the British White Paper, which is very harsh quotas of immigration of Jews to the land. And even when the noose of European Jewry is being tightened by the Nazis, there's really no place for them to go. FDR has all these policies of restricting immigration to the United States, and even in Israel, the Jewish people can't go there. And even after World War II, and even after the Holocaust, the Brits didn't relent. And there's many episodes, sad episodes of Jewish refugees and Jewish displaced people. They want to go to Israel. Their whole families, their whole towns are wiped out. They want to start a new life, and the Brits say, no, we only allow 20,000 Jews to come. Sorry. So the Jewish underground in Israel, they took matters into their own hands. And the most famous of those groups is called the Irgun. The Irgun is led by Menachem Begin, who is going to eventually become prime minister as well, one of the great heroes of Israel. And Menachem Begin, his philosophy was, okay, you kill us, we'll kill two of yours. And they have all these reprisal attacks against the British. And in the most famous event was when they went to the King David Hotel. And that was the headquarters of British High Command. And they put a massive bomb in the basement. And they called up the hotel and said, okay, we put a bomb in. You better get everyone out. We don't want to have unnecessary human casualties. And the Brits, classic example of British punctiliousness, they say, you know what? We're going to bar people from leaving. And sadly, 30 minutes later, the whole building was blown apart, and 90 people died. Many of them were actually Jews. But these attacks, it just caused so much incessant fighting. The Brits had to have 100,000 soldiers in Israel, in Palestine, what was then Palestine. They didn't want to deal with it. So they said, you know what? The newly formed United Nations, this is your problem. And in the year 1947, the famous date, the 29th of November, the United Nations voted in favor of the partition plan. They took Palestine, divided up half for the Arabs, half for the Jews, and Jerusalem's going to be an international city. Everyone should be happy. The Jews accepted the deal. The Arabs refused it. And that has happened every single time there was a proposal to have some sort of agreement, two states for two people. Even though the portion the Jewish people got was highly indefensible, it was disjointed, it was very unfavorable, still they accepted it. But the Arabs refused. And thus, the Brits decided, we're leaving. We don't care what kind of hell results from our vacuum. On May 14th, 1948, we're leaving. Whatever happens, happens. So they notified the United Nations that they're going to terminate the mandate in Palestine in 1948 on the 14th of May. During the months leading up to it, Jerusalem is cut off from the rest of the Jewish Palestine. You have the center of Jewish life is in Tel Aviv. And there still is a Jewish community in Jerusalem, but they're surrounded by Arabs from all sides. And we know Jerusalem is a mountain. And to get to Jerusalem, you have to pass through many valleys. And every time there was convoys sent with materials, with arms, with water, with medicine, with food, to go support the Jewish Jerusalem, they were pockmarked from Arab snipers and Arab bombs. And actually, until today, you could see the burnt-out carcasses of those convoys on the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv road. And the only way around it was they had to build what's known as the Burma Road. They built a makeshift road on one of the mountains, and they managed to avoid the entire problem, and they managed to get supplies to Jewish Jerusalem. On May 14th, in the late afternoon, several hours before the British garrison was going to withdraw, the State of Israel was declared and immediately attacked by 5 Arab armies. This began the War of Independence. Jewish Jerusalem was still besieged under very fierce artillery and sniper attacks. Efforts were made by the Jews in the course of the war, by the Israelis, to secure the city. At the end of the fighting in 1949, by the armistice lines, it cut right through Jerusalem. And the Jews who were living in the Old City, for example, that was part of Jordanian territory. They were kicked out of their homes. All the synagogues there were blown up. And Jerusalem is going to be a divided city for the next 19 years. In the year 1967, a war erupted between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In only 6 days, Israel conquered Gaza, the Sinai Desert, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Jerusalem's Old City and eastern half. Again, the Holy City is reunited. During that month, a very famous song debuted that captured the spirit of the times. Jerusalem of gold, Yerushalayim shel zahav. Some choice quotes. We return to the cisterns, the square and the marketplace. A shofar blows in Temple Mount in the Old City. And in the caves, in the stone, 1,000 suns shine. We shall return and descend to Yam HaMelech by way of Yericho. It was a time of unimaginable euphoria. They cleared away all the squalor of by the Kotel. They expanded the plaza. There are those that lament the fact that during the war there wasn't like an errant missile sent to Temple Mount. That's a separate question. Regardless, several days after they conquered the Old City, Moshe Dayan made a horrific decision, or maybe it was a fortuitous one, depends on your position, to hand the keys to Temple Mount back to the Muslim Waqf, to the Muslim religious authority. Jewish people had control of Temple Mount for like 5 or 6 hours. Regardless, we still continue praying today with the same text that was codified 2,400 years ago by the men of the Great Assembly. We pray to God, may you return to your city, Jerusalem.